For 24 years, Judge Evelyn Whitmore sat high on her bench, handing down rulings that destroyed lives. No one questioned her. No one stopped her. Until one man walked into her courtroom, not just to win a case, but to expose the truth. What happened next shocked an entire county. A rigged trial. A corrupt judge. And a defense attorney who refused to back down. If you've ever felt like the system was stacked against the little guy, this story will remind you of one simple truth: justice isn't given, it's taken by those willing to fight for it. For nearly a quarter of a century, Judge Evelyn Whitmore reigned over her courtroom in Jefferson County, Alabama, with an iron grip. She was not just a judge, she was the law. Attorneys, defendants, and even fellow court officials understood one thing: in her courtroom, there were no fair trials, only predetermined outcomes. Judge Whitmore had perfected the art of quiet dominance. She rarely raised her voice, but when she did speak, her words carried an authority that crushed opposition like a hammer striking an anvil. She ruled from her high bench, peering over the rim of her reading glasses, eyes sharp as scalpels. Her rulings were swift, her objections selective, and her sentences severe. To the casual observer, she seemed like an uncompromising enforcer of the law. But those who had spent years inside her courtroom knew the truth: justice had nothing to do with it. Her power was built on fear. Attorneys, particularly those representing black clients, knew what to expect when stepping into her courtroom. Their motions were denied without consideration. Their objections were waved off as though they were nothing more than irritating noise. The prosecution, however, received a different treatment entirely. Young, ambitious district attorneys flourished under her watchful eye, guided through their missteps like favored students being groomed for success. The most insidious part of her rule was that it was never blatant enough to be easily proven. There were no recorded bribes, no explicit orders to rule unfairly. Instead, there were patterns that were impossible to ignore for those who had suffered under them. Defendants of color found themselves buried under harsh sentences, while others facing similar charges walked away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. For Judge Whitmore, power was not just about handing down verdicts. It was about control. She controlled the tempo of the courtroom, the fate of the accused, and even the career trajectories of young attorneys who either played by her rules or suffered the consequences. Those who dared to challenge her authority were met with swift and humiliating reprimands, some finding themselves held in contempt of court for nothing more than insisting on fairness. Her reputation spread beyond the heavy oak doors of her courtroom. At bar association meetings, lawyers whispered her name like a cautionary tale. They spoke of cases that had been doomed before the first argument was ever made. They discussed clients who had walked into her courtroom with hope, only to leave in shackles, their lives shattered by a system that was supposed to protect them. For 24 years, she ruled without challenge, her unchecked power stretching far beyond the marble floors of the courthouse. No one dared to stop her, until one man finally did. For years, the Jefferson County Courthouse had been a place where justice was a mere illusion, especially for those who found themselves standing before Judge Evelyn Whitmore. The courtroom was her kingdom, and her rulings were absolute. But that was before Benjamin Carter walked through those heavy wooden doors. At 48 years old, Carter was not just another defense attorney. He was a fighter. A man who had built his reputation on taking cases that others wouldn't touch. He wasn't the type to chase high-profile clients or lucrative corporate deals, he fought for the ones who had no one else in their corner. His name carried weight far beyond Alabama. Prosecutors dreaded him. Judges resented him. And yet, his clients trusted him, because he was known for one thing: exposing the truth, no matter the cost. On this particular morning, Carter wasn't just there to defend another client. He was there to challenge a system that had been rigged for decades. His client, Marcus Williams, had been falsely accused of armed robbery, and the evidence against him was paper-thin. But Carter knew the real battle wasn't against the district attorney's office, it was against Judge Whitmore herself. From the moment he entered the courtroom, he felt her eyes on him. Cold, dismissive. She barely acknowledged his presence as she scanned through the case file. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with impatience, "you're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." It was a warning, one that lesser attorneys might have taken to heart. But Carter simply straightened his tie and met her gaze. "I'll try not to, Your Honor," he said evenly. What followed was not a trial, it was a performance. Whitmore played her role with precision, overruling Carter's objections before he could finish his sentences, guiding the young prosecutor like a teacher coaching a student through his first big case. But Carter had been in courtrooms like this before. He knew when to push and when to let his opponent expose themselves. Then, the moment came. When the prosecution introduced undisclosed evidence, a clear violation of legal precedent, Carter seized it. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "this is a direct violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Whitmore barely looked up. "Denied." Carter let the silence hang. Then, he asked again. "Just to be clear, Your Honor, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even fear, crossed her face before she slammed her gavel down. "Enough, Mr. Carter." And that was it. She had exposed herself. The jury saw it. The reporters scribbled furiously. The courtroom, once suffocated by her authority, began to shift. Benjamin Carter hadn't just entered a trial that day, he had set the stage for a reckoning. And for the first time in 24 years, Judge Whitmore was no longer in control. From the moment Benjamin Carter stepped into Judge Evelyn Whitmore's courtroom, he knew the outcome had already been decided. This wasn't justice. It was theater. A scripted performance where the roles had been assigned long before the first argument was ever made. The prosecution, led by an eager, young district attorney named Peter Calloway, was not particularly skilled. He stumbled over his words, hesitated with his objections, and at times, seemed unsure of his own arguments. But none of that mattered. Because standing behind him, like an invisible hand guiding a puppet, was Judge Whitmore. She had spent years perfecting her method of control. A raised eyebrow here, a well-timed sigh there. A quiet, cutting remark to dismiss the defense without having to offer a real reason. Carter, an experienced trial attorney, had seen bad judges before. But this was something else. Every time he raised an objection, it was overruled without hesitation. Every time Calloway made a mistake, Whitmore corrected him, practically coaching him in front of the jury. The pattern was undeniable. When the defense challenged the validity of witness testimony, she dismissed it as irrelevant. When the prosecution introduced evidence that hadn't been disclosed before trial, a direct violation of the law, she simply waved it away. Carter leaned toward his client, Marcus Williams, a young black man falsely accused of armed robbery. Marcus sat stiffly, hands clenched under the table, as though bracing for the inevitable. He had seen this before. He knew how these trials worked. "The jury sees it," Carter whispered to him. "They may not admit it yet, but they see it." Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, I assume you have something of substance to contribute, or are you simply wasting this court's time?" Carter stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the prosecution has just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in pretrial discovery. That is a Brady violation, and I am moving for an immediate mistrial." Whitmore barely looked up. "Denied." Carter let the silence stretch, making sure everyone in the courtroom had time to process what had just happened. He could see it, the shifting in seats, the way a few jurors glanced at each other uncomfortably. Even Calloway seemed unsure of what to do next. "To be clear, Your Honor," Carter said carefully, "you are refusing to acknowledge a clear violation of Brady versus Maryland?" Whitmore's eyes darkened. "I said denied, Mr. Carter." And there it was. The moment where bias turned into something more, something undeniable. The reporters in the back of the room scribbled furiously. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. The jury, sworn to impartiality, could no longer pretend they weren't witnessing an injustice unfold in real time. Carter sat back down, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just here to defend his client, he was here to expose the truth. And with every biased ruling, Judge Whitmore was doing his job for him. Benjamin Carter had been in tough courtrooms before. He had faced biased judges, overzealous prosecutors, and juries that had already made up their minds before the first piece of evidence was presented. But this case was different. This wasn't just about defending his client, Marcus Williams, this was about exposing a corrupt system that had operated unchecked for decades. Judge Evelyn Whitmore thought she was in control. For 24 years, she had ruled from her bench with unquestioned authority, making sure that cases played out exactly as she wanted. She didn't need to take bribes outright. Her favoritism, her bias, her disdain for defense attorneys like Carter were enough to determine the outcome of any trial before it even began. But she had underestimated him. Carter knew he couldn't beat Whitmore with sheer force. He couldn't yell, couldn't argue too aggressively, because that would give her the excuse she needed to hold him in contempt and remove him from the courtroom. Instead, he needed her to expose herself, to let her arrogance and unchecked power do the work for him. It started with small things. Every time she overruled one of his objections without a valid legal reason, he let it sit in the air just long enough for the jury to notice. When she dismissed key evidence in favor of the prosecution, he made sure the court reporter recorded every word. He spoke calmly, measuredly, ensuring that everything he said painted a picture, not just of his client's innocence, but of the judge's blatant disregard for justice. Then, the moment came. The prosecution introduced new evidence that had never been disclosed before trial, a clear violation of Brady versus Maryland. Carter knew it, and more importantly, he knew Whitmore knew it too. "Your Honor," he said, rising to his feet, "the prosecution has just presented evidence that was not disclosed in discovery. That is a direct violation of due process. I move for an immediate mistrial." Whitmore barely looked up. "Denied." Carter let the words hang in the air. "To be clear, Your Honor," he said, "you are refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Her jaw tightened. "I said denied, Mr. Carter." The courtroom shifted. The jury exchanged glances. The gallery stirred. Even the young prosecutor, Peter Calloway, looked uneasy. Carter tilted his head slightly. "For the record, Your Honor, you are knowingly allowing the introduction of undisclosed evidence." Whitmore's face hardened. "Mr. Carter, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt." Carter smiled just slightly. He had her. Inside, he could feel the weight of the moment shifting. Whitmore wasn't just biased, she was reckless. And now, the whole courtroom could see it. The jury saw it. The reporters in the gallery were scribbling furiously. Even the court officers, who had worked under her rule for years, had to acknowledge what was happening. Judge Whitmore wasn't just losing control of the courtroom. She was exposing herself in real time. And Carter was just getting started. For 24 years, Judge Evelyn Whitmore had ruled her courtroom with absolute authority. Defense attorneys feared her. Prosecutors thrived under her protection. Defendants, particularly black men like Marcus Williams, knew the odds were stacked against them the moment they stepped through the heavy oak doors of her courtroom. She was untouchable, until the doors swung open. The moment was so sudden, so shocking, that for a brief second, no one moved. The only sound was the sharp click of dress shoes against the marble floor as two federal agents strode into the courtroom, their movements crisp and deliberate. Every eye in the room turned toward them, but Benjamin Carter didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands on the defense table and waited. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, it was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Judge Whitmore, however, did react. Her eyes flickered with irritation, then confusion. No one interrupted her courtroom. No one challenged her authority. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her fingers tightening just slightly as she straightened her back. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice still carrying the sharp authority that had silenced so many before. One of the agents, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and flashed his badge. "Judge Evelyn Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to speak with you immediately." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Whitmore scoffed, shaking her head. "I am in the middle of a trial," she said, her tone clipped with impatience. "Whatever this is, it will have to wait until I conclude these proceedings." The second agent stepped forward, this time addressing the entire room. "This is a matter of federal interest," he announced. "It cannot wait." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. The jury sat frozen, eyes darting between the agents, Whitmore, and Carter, who remained still, watching the scene unfold with quiet precision. Peter Calloway, the young prosecutor who had built his career under Whitmore's protection, cleared his throat, his voice uneasy. Should we take a recess, Your Honor?" "No," Whitmore snapped, her voice too sharp, too forced. "We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow." The first agent interrupted. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. For the first time in her career, Judge Evelyn Whitmore lost control of her courtroom. Carter let the moment settle. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. He turned to the jury, then the gallery, then finally, he looked straight at her. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems this trial is no longer your biggest concern." Whitmore's face drained of color. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. "Evelyn Whitmore, you are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations under federal law." The room erupted. The jury exchanged stunned glances. The reporters scribbled furiously. Even the court officers, the very people who had once followed her every order without question, seemed momentarily frozen in place. Whitmore looked at the agents, then at the paper, then finally at Carter. For the first time, she truly saw him, not just as another attorney arguing a case before her, but as the man who had been waiting for this exact moment. "Mr. Carter," she said, and for the first time, her voice was unsteady. Carter picked up his briefcase and stepped forward, locking eyes with her. "I follow the law, Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering. "Even when the law fails people like my client." The lead agent moved to the bench. "Judge, we need you to stand." Whitmore hesitated. Then, finally, she did. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed through the courtroom, a final, unmistakable judgment against the woman who had once judged so many. For years, Judge Evelyn Whitmore had stood as an unshakable force in Jefferson County's judicial system. She wielded power not just through her rulings but through an atmosphere of intimidation, making sure that no one, not an attorney, a defendant, or even a fellow judge, dared to challenge her authority. And yet, here she was, standing in her own courtroom with her wrists bound in cold steel. The room was silent, an unnatural, stunned stillness that seemed to press down on every person present. Moments earlier, Whitmore had ruled with unchecked power, dismissing objections, controlling the pace of the trial, ensuring that her favored prosecutor had every advantage. Now, she stood in the very spot where she had sentenced so many others, her authority stripped away in an instant. The jury sat frozen, their eyes darting between the federal agents, the judge, and Benjamin Carter, the defense attorney who had orchestrated it all. Some looked uneasy, others openly stunned. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny what they had just witnessed, the exposure of a judge who had once seemed invincible. The prosecution table was eerily quiet. Peter Calloway, the young district attorney who had spent the entire trial basking in Whitmore's favoritism, sat motionless, gripping the edge of his legal pad like it was a life raft. His face, once filled with confidence, was now pale, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched beneath his skin. He had walked into this trial believing it was a guaranteed win, but now, with Whitmore taken away in handcuffs, he looked like a man who had just watched his entire future unravel before his eyes. From the gallery, whispers spread like wildfire. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against notepads as they tried to capture every last detail. Court staff, bailiffs, clerks, even those who had worked under Whitmore for years, stood stiffly, unsure whether to react or remain impassive. They had followed her every command without question, but now, they were witnessing a reckoning. At the defense table, Marcus Williams sat motionless, his hands still resting on the table in front of him. For years, he had seen men like himself crushed by a system that never gave them a fair chance. He had walked into this courtroom expecting the same fate. But now, for the first time, something had changed. He turned to Benjamin Carter, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought people like her never had to pay for what they did." Carter exhaled slowly, watching as the courtroom absorbed the weight of what had just happened. He had spent years fighting battles that never seemed to make a difference, taking on cases where the deck was always stacked against him. But this moment was different. "They do," he said, his voice steady. "It just takes the right person to make it happen." The doors to the courtroom swung shut behind the federal agents as they led Whitmore away. And for the first time in decades, her courtroom no longer belonged to her. The echoes of Judge Evelyn Whitmore's arrest still hung in the air. Her absence left a gaping void in the courtroom, a space once ruled by her iron grip, now silent and uncertain. But Benjamin Carter wasn't done. He had fought this case not just for his client, Marcus Williams, but for every person who had ever been crushed by the system Judge Whitmore had manipulated for years. And now, with her removed from power, it was time to finish what he had started. Carter stood, straightened his tie, and turned to face the new judge, a man hastily brought in from another courtroom, an older black judge whose calm demeanor and reputation for fairness preceded him. "Your Honor," Carter said, his voice unwavering, "given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." This entire trial was compromised from the start. The judge who presided over this case was just arrested for corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. Every ruling she made, every decision she enforced, was tainted. The new judge listened carefully, his fingers interlocked as he considered Carter's words. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. "On what grounds, Mr. Carter?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Carter turned, addressing the jury, the gallery, and the prosecution all at once. His voice was firm, deliberate. Judge Whitmore was never impartial. She manipulated this case from day one. She ignored critical evidence, overruled valid objections, and made sure my client never stood a fair chance. We all saw it. This wasn't a trial, it was a performance, orchestrated to ensure a guilty verdict before the first witness even took the stand. But now that the woman behind it all is facing justice herself, it's time to undo the damage she caused. The only appropriate action is to dismiss these charges and restore the justice that my client was denied. A hush fell over the room. The new judge let the words settle before nodding slowly. "I agree," he said at last. The silence that followed was deafening. "The charges against Marcus Williams are hereby dismissed," the judge announced. "Remove his restraints." For a moment, no one moved. It was as though time itself had paused, as if the people in the room needed just a second longer to fully absorb what had just happened. Then, the soft click of handcuffs unlocking shattered the stillness. A bailiff stepped forward and carefully unshackled Marcus' wrists. He sat there, stunned, rubbing the sore marks left behind by years of a system that had sought to break him. It wasn't until he flexed his hands that, for the first time in too long, were truly free, that reality set in. He turned to Carter, his voice thick with disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." Carter placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. Because for once, the system worked the way it was supposed to. In the gallery, a slow murmur grew into a quiet wave of approval. The reporters in the back scribbled frantically, capturing every detail. Some of the jurors, now realizing just how close they had come to condemning an innocent man, exchanged uneasy glances. Even Peter Calloway, the once arrogant prosecutor, sat motionless, staring at the desk in front of him. The fight wasn't over, not for Carter, and certainly not for the countless others who had been victims of judges like Whitmore. But today, justice had prevailed. And Marcus Williams walked out of that courtroom a free man. As Marcus Williams stepped out of the courthouse, a free man at last, Benjamin Carter took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was heavy, years of injustice overturned in a single ruling. But as satisfying as this victory was, Carter knew one simple truth: this was just one battle in a much larger war. For every Marcus Williams who walked free, there were countless others still trapped in a system that was rigged against them. Judge Evelyn Whitmore may have been taken down, but she was not the only one. There were more like her, judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, who had built careers on bending the law to serve their own interests. Some were careless, like Whitmore, making their corruption obvious. Others were more cunning, more patient, and harder to catch. Carter had spent his career fighting against them, and today's victory only proved one thing: he had to keep going. The courtroom was still buzzing as he walked toward the exit, past reporters eager for a statement, past lawyers who had once dismissed him but now looked at him with something close to respect. But Carter wasn't here for their approval. He was here for justice. And justice wasn't won in a single trial, it was a never-ending fight. With the courthouse behind him, he pulled out his phone, already preparing for the next case. Because there would always be another one. Another innocent man. Another corrupt official. Another battle. And Benjamin Carter wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Justice is not automatic, it must be fought for. Benjamin Carter's story reminds us that corruption thrives when good people remain silent. Judge Evelyn Whitmore ruled her courtroom for decades, unchecked and unchallenged, because people believed she was untouchable. But no one is above the law. Carter's determination proves that one person, armed with the truth and persistence, can bring even the most powerful to justice. This lesson is not just about the legal system, it applies to life itself. Whether it's standing up against injustice, speaking out when something is wrong, or simply refusing to accept the status quo, real change begins with those who refuse to give up. Many of us have witnessed unfairness in our own lives, at work, in our communities, or even within our families. The question is, do we look the other way, or? Carter's fight didn't end with one trial. It was part of a lifelong commitment to truth and fairness. As we grow older, our voices carry wisdom and experience. Let's use them to stand for what's right, to hold those in power accountable, and to remind the next generation that justice is only possible